Camille, what did you just do?
16-year-old Destiny Coleman was carrying a stack of dinner plates through the Reid family's formal dining room when Camille Reid rose from her chair, crossed the room in 3 sharp strides, and slapped her hard enough across the face that the sound cut clean through 12 guests' conversation and silenced the entire table. "That is the 3rd plate you've nearly dropped tonight," Camille said, her voice carrying the specific, controlled fury of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the preceding 20 minutes, that an orphan foster placement working her household for the summer had become an acceptable target for her own accumulated frustrations. "I don't know why my husband insists on hiring children who can't perform basic tasks." Destiny stood frozen, one hand pressed against her stinging cheek, the stack of plates somehow still balanced in her other arm, refusing, in front of 12 strangers in evening wear, to let a single tear actually fall. Marcus Reid walked through the dining room's east entrance at the exact moment his wife's hand made contact with the girl's face, close enough to see everything, his own expression shifting, within a single second, from mild confusion into something considerably darker. "Camille." His voice, when it finally came, was quiet. It was also the only sound in that entire room, and every single guest at that table understood immediately, from the specific, controlled weight of it, that whatever happened next was about to matter considerably more than a ruined dinner party. What Marcus didn't know yet, what he was still several minutes from understanding, standing in that sudden, terrible silence, was that the 16-year-old girl his wife had just struck across the face wasn't simply an unfortunate placement from a local foster program. She was his daughter. The one he'd been told, 16 years earlier, had died within days of her birth. Before I tell you exactly how Marcus Reid discovered the truth his wife had no idea she was standing in the middle of, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this story is worth staying for all the way through. Like this video if you believe every child deserves to be protected fiercely, share it with somebody who needs the reminder that the truth has its own timing, and drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to understand exactly how Destiny Coleman ended up serving dinner in the house of the father she never knew was still alive. Marcus Reid met Tanya Coleman when he was 26 years old, both of them working entry-level positions at a mid-sized logistics firm in Atlanta, years before Marcus would go on to found Reid Dynamics, the supply chain technology company that would eventually make him one of the city's most prominent business figures. Their relationship lasted just under a year, ending, as many young relationships do, more from mismatched life circumstances than any particular conflict between them. Marcus accepting a demanding new position in Chicago that required relocating just as Tanya discovered she was pregnant. A discovery she chose, for reasons that would only become clear to Marcus 16 years later, not to share with him at the time. Tanya's own family, deeply religious and considerably conservative, reacted to her pregnancy with a specific, painful shame that pressured her, throughout the following months, toward a decision she would later describe, in private letters Marcus wouldn't discover until years afterward, as the hardest of her entire life. Facing her family's disapproval and her own uncertain financial circumstances as a single mother, Tanya made contact with Marcus exactly once during her pregnancy, informing him only that she'd lost the baby, a devastating loss Marcus grieved privately and completely, having no reason whatsoever to doubt the truth of what she told him. What actually happened was considerably more complicated. Tanya gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom she named Destiny, and raised her alone for the first 4 years of her life before Tanya's own health began declining rapidly due to a previously undiagnosed heart condition. A decline that would eventually take her life when Destiny was just 5 years old, leaving her daughter to enter the foster care system with no surviving family able or willing to take her in. Destiny grew up moving through Georgia's foster care system for the following 11 years, cycling through 6 different placements by the time she turned 16, none of them abusive exactly, but none of them offering the kind of stable, genuine family connection every child fundamentally needs to develop a secure sense of their own worth in the world. She carried, throughout those difficult years, a small collection of her mother's belongings, a few photographs, a journal Tanya had kept during her final illness, and a single, faded letter Tanya had written but never sent, addressed simply to Destiny's father. A letter Destiny had read so many times throughout her childhood that she'd memorized entire passages of it, despite having no name, no address, no way of ever actually delivering it to the man it was intended for. That letter, which Tanya had apparently written during a period of genuine remorse roughly a year before her death, acknowledged in careful, guilt-heavy language, the lie she'd told about losing the baby, along with a specific, aching hope that someday, somehow, Destiny might find her way to the father who deserved to know the truth about the daughter he'd never gotten the chance to raise. Destiny had no name to search for. Tanya's letter, protecting Marcus's privacy even in her own private confession, never once mentioned him by name, leaving Destiny, throughout her entire childhood, with nothing more than the aching knowledge that her father was somewhere out in the world, entirely unaware that his daughter had survived, and no realistic path toward ever finding him. Destiny arrived at the Reid family estate 3 months before this story's central event. Placed there through a structured summer work program her most recent foster placement had connected her with. A program designed to give older foster youth genuine work experience and modest income while completing their final years of high school. She approached the household staff position with the same quiet, careful diligence she brought to nearly everything in her life, a diligence born from years of understanding. At a fundamental level, that stability in her life had never once been guaranteed, and that consistent, reliable effort represented one of the few things genuinely within her own control. Marcus Reid, who maintained only occasional, distant awareness of the household staffing decisions his wife Camille typically oversaw directly, had met Destiny only briefly during her initial placement interview, a polite, unremarkable exchange that gave him no particular reason to look more closely at the quiet, hard-working teenager who had entered his household that summer. Camille Reid, by contrast, had developed, over the preceding 3 months, an increasingly harsh and demanding relationship with nearly all of the household staff, a pattern rooted, those close to the family would later understand, in Camille's own considerable anxiety about maintaining the family's carefully cultivated social image, anxiety that manifested, with increasing frequency, as sharp, controlling cruelty toward anyone she perceived as falling short of her exacting standards. Destiny, quiet and new to the household, had become, over those 3 months, one of Camille's most frequent targets. The formal dinner party at the center of this story was, for Camille, an enormously significant social occasion, a gathering of Marcus's most important business partners and their spouses, an evening Camille had spent weeks meticulously planning, determined that every single detail reflect exactly the kind of flawless social standing she'd worked to cultivate throughout her entire marriage to Marcus. Destiny had been assigned to assist with serving that evening, a responsibility she approached with her usual careful diligence, despite considerable nervousness about the evening's obvious significance to the family she worked for. The evening progressed reasonably smoothly through its opening courses, though Camille's underlying tension remained visible to household staff throughout, a specific, controlled anxiety that Rosa, the household's longtime housekeeper, would later describe as worse than usual, even for her. A warning Rosa had quietly passed to Destiny earlier that evening without either of them fully anticipating exactly how that tension would eventually manifest. The incident itself began with something genuinely minor. Destiny, carrying a stack of dessert plates through a crowded section of the dining room, momentarily lost her balance navigating around a guest's unexpectedly extended chair, the plates wobbling precariously for a brief, tense second before Destiny managed to steady them completely, without a single plate actually falling or breaking. That brief wobble, harmless in its actual outcome, proved to be exactly the trigger Camille's mounting tension had apparently been searching for throughout the entire evening. Camille rose from her seat with a speed that immediately silenced the nearby conversation, crossing the room in 3 sharp, deliberate strides before Destiny had even fully registered her employer's approach. "That is the 3rd plate you've nearly dropped tonight," Camille said, her voice carrying a controlled fury that had clearly been building throughout the entire evening, finally finding its release. "I don't know why my husband insists on hiring children who can't perform basic tasks." Her hand connected with Destiny's face before the girl had any real chance to respond or defend herself. The sound of that slap cutting cleanly through the room's ambient conversation, silencing all 12 guests in the same devastating instant. Destiny stood frozen, one hand instinctively rising to press against her stinging cheek. The stack of plates still somehow balanced in her other arm through nothing but sheer reflexive discipline, refusing, in front of an entire room of strangers in expensive evening wear, to let a single tear actually fall, though the effort of maintaining that composure was evident to anyone paying close enough attention. The room fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence, several guests exchanging uneasy glances, none of them quite certain how to respond to witnessing their host's wife physically strike a household employee in the middle of a formal dinner party. It was into that exact silence that Marcus Reid walked through the dining room's east entrance, having stepped away briefly to take an urgent business call, returning just in time to witness the final, devastating second of his wife's hand making contact with a teenage girl's face. Marcus stopped just inside the entrance, his own expression shifting rapidly from mild confusion about the room's sudden silence, into something considerably darker, as he processed exactly what he'd just witnessed. Camille. His voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled, carrying a weight that immediately silenced any remaining ambient movement in the room. What did you just do? Marcus, she nearly dropped an entire stack of plates for the third time tonight. You struck her, Marcus said, cutting through his wife's explanation with a directness that visibly startled several guests, none of whom had ever witnessed this particular tone from Marcus Reid throughout years of professional and social interaction with him. In front of our guests, a teenage girl working in our home. Marcus crossed the room himself, moving directly toward Destiny rather than continuing to address his wife, his attention shifting entirely toward the visibly shaken girl still standing frozen near the center of the dining room. Are you all right? He asked, his voice shifting into something considerably gentler than the controlled fury he'd just directed at Camille. I need you to be honest with me. It was in that exact moment, standing close enough to look directly into Destiny's face for the first time with genuine, focused attention, that Marcus noticed something that stopped his own breath entirely. A small, distinctive birthmark just below her left ear, in precisely the same location and shape as one Tanya Coleman had carried her entire life, a detail Marcus hadn't consciously thought about in over 15 years, but that his own memory apparently hadn't forgotten. Marcus stood frozen for a long moment, staring at that small, distinctive birthmark, a growing, disorienting sense of recognition beginning to override even his considerable anger at his wife's behavior only moments earlier. What's your name? He asked Destiny, his voice carrying a strange, careful urgency that confused her, given everything else currently unfolding in that tense dining room. Destiny, she said quietly, still holding her stinging cheek. Destiny Coleman. Marcus felt something cold and disorienting move through his entire chest, hearing that specific last name, a name he hadn't spoken or heard aloud in years, a name that belonged to exactly one person he'd ever known well enough for it to carry any real significance. Coleman, Marcus repeated slowly. Was your mother's name Tanya? Destiny's own expression shifted rapidly from confusion into a genuine startled shock, having never once, throughout her entire 16 years, heard a stranger correctly guess her mother's name without any apparent prior information to draw from. How do you know that? She asked, her voice carrying a mixture of fear and cautious, disbelieving hope. The entire dinner party, Camille included, watched this exchange unfold in a stunned, confused silence, none of them yet understanding the full significance of what was happening in front of them, though several guests would later describe sensing, even in that confused moment, that they were witnessing something considerably more significant than an employer's simple concern for an injured employee. Marcus, his hands visibly unsteady, asked Rosa to take Destiny to a private sitting room to properly tend to her injury, making clear, in a tone that left no room for discussion, that he intended to follow shortly to continue their conversation privately. He then turned back to his assembled guests, offering a brief, controlled apology for the evening's disruption before formally ending the dinner party considerably earlier than planned, a decision that visibly stunned Camille, who had spent weeks meticulously planning an evening now concluding in genuine chaos. Marcus, you cannot possibly be ending this dinner over a member of the household staff, Camille said, once the last guests had departed, her voice carrying disbelief rather than any genuine remorse for what she'd done. This is completely unreasonable. Camille, I need you to understand something clearly, right now before we discuss anything else, Marcus said, his voice carrying a controlled intensity that silenced whatever further protest Camille had been preparing. That girl's mother was someone I knew years before we ever met. I have reason to believe, based on what just happened in there, that Destiny might be my daughter. A daughter I was told had died at birth, 16 years ago. Camille's face went visibly pale, the full, devastating weight of exactly what she'd just done finally beginning to register. Marcus found Destiny in the private sitting room roughly 20 minutes later. An ice pack pressed against her cheek, Rosa sitting beside her offering quiet, comforting support. I need to ask you something important, Marcus said, sitting down carefully across from her, his own hands still visibly unsteady. You mentioned your mother's name was Tanya. Can you tell me more about her? Anything you remember or anything you might have of hers? Destiny, still processing the shock of the evening's events, reached instinctively for the small bag she carried nearly everywhere. Retrieving the collection of her mother's belongings she'd carried through 6 different foster placements over 11 years. The photographs, the journal, and finally, the letter Tanya had written but never sent. She wrote this before she died, Destiny said quietly, handing the folded, worn letter to Marcus with hands that were shaking nearly as much as his own. It's addressed to my father. I've never known who he actually is. She never wrote his name anywhere I could find. Marcus unfolded that letter with a careful, trembling reverence, reading Tanya's own handwriting for the first time in over 16 years, absorbing her private confession about the lie she'd told him, her genuine remorse, and her aching hope that someday, somehow, their daughter might find her way back to the father who deserved to know the truth. He finished reading, tears now falling freely, and looked up at Destiny with an expression she would later describe as containing more raw emotion than she'd ever witnessed from any adult throughout her entire difficult childhood. Destiny, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I think I might be your father. Marcus arranged for a paternity test within days of that devastating, emotional conversation, understanding, even amid his own overwhelming emotion, the importance of confirming this connection with absolute, undeniable certainty before either of them allowed themselves to fully process what it might mean for both their lives going forward. The results confirmed 12 days later, established with complete certainty exactly what both Marcus and Destiny had already, on some deep emotional level, begun to believe. Destiny Coleman was indeed his biological daughter. The child he genuinely believed had died at birth 16 years earlier, alive and grown into a remarkable, resilient young woman who had survived 11 years within a foster care system entirely unaware that her actual father was alive, successful, and would have moved every possible resource to find and raise her had he ever known the truth. Marcus spent those 12 days of waiting in a state of profound, complicated grief and hope simultaneously, mourning 16 years of a relationship stolen from both of them by Tanya's difficult, understandable but devastating decision, while also carrying a genuine, overwhelming joy at the possibility that his daughter, whom he'd spent over a decade believing lost, might actually still be alive and within his reach. He also began during those same 12 days a difficult, necessary reckoning with his marriage to Camille, whose cruelty toward household staff, and toward Destiny specifically, had suddenly taken on a devastating new significance now that he understood exactly who Destiny actually was. Marcus confronted Camille directly once the paternity results confirmed what he'd already begun to believe, a conversation that revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how thoroughly Camille's own insecurities and cruelty had shaped years of their marriage, extending now into a devastating collision with his own newly discovered daughter. You struck my daughter, Camille, Marcus said, his voice carrying a controlled devastation that Camille had never once witnessed from him throughout their entire marriage. A girl who spent 16 years in foster care, believing she had no family at all, because her mother made an impossible choice to protect her from a family that couldn't accept her, and because I was told a lie that kept me from ever finding her myself. And the first significant interaction she had with our own household was you striking her across the face in front of 12 strangers. Camille, to her credit, didn't attempt the kind of deflection or minimization she'd offered immediately following the incident itself, sitting instead in a genuine, visible horror as the full weight of what she'd done settled fully into her own understanding. I didn't know, Camille said quietly. I know that's not an excuse for striking anyone, regardless of who they turned out to be. I need you to understand, Marcus, that I'm genuinely horrified by what I did, entirely separate from learning who she actually is. Marcus, while acknowledging Camille's apparent genuine distress, made clear that the incident represented far more than a single, isolated lapse in judgment, citing a broader pattern of cruelty toward household staff that he'd apparently, uncomfortably, allowed to continue unaddressed for far too long throughout their marriage. Marcus began, immediately following the confirmed paternity results, the formal legal process of establishing full parental custody, and beginning Destiny's transition into his household not as staff, but as his own daughter, a process that involved considerable coordination with Georgia's foster care system, given Destiny's existing status as a ward of the state. He also began, during this same period, the difficult, necessary work of building an actual relationship with a 16-year-old daughter he'd only just met, understanding clearly that biological confirmation alone couldn't instantly produce the kind of genuine parental bond that typically develops gradually over an entire childhood. I know this doesn't erase 16 years, Marcus told Destiny, during one of their early conversations following the legal proceedings that formally established his custody. I can't give you back the childhood you should have had, with a father who knew you existed and moved everything in his power to find you. What I can do is make absolutely certain that everything from this point forward reflects exactly how much you deserve to be protected and valued, in ways you should have had all along. Destiny, understandably cautious after 11 years of unstable placements and shifting caregivers, approached this sudden, dramatic change in her circumstances with careful, measured hope rather than immediate, uncomplicated trust, a caution Marcus respected fully, understanding exactly how much genuine, demonstrated consistency he would need to provide before Destiny could reasonably be expected to feel fully secure in this entirely new chapter of her life. Marcus and Camille's marriage, already strained considerably by years of Camille's documented pattern of cruelty toward household staff, did not survive the aftermath of this specific incident, Marcus filing for divorce roughly 2 months after Destiny's paternity was formally confirmed, a decision he described, in later comments addressing the situation, as reflecting considerably more than simply the incident with Destiny alone. I spent years making excuses for a pattern I should have addressed considerably sooner, Marcus said. Watching Camille strike my own daughter, someone I'd only just discovered was alive, forced me to finally see clearly something I'd been avoiding examining honestly for far too long about our entire marriage. Camille faced separate legal consequences as well, Destiny's caseworker, upon learning the full details of the incident, filing a formal report that resulted in Camille being charged with simple assault, a charge that, combined with the considerable public attention the story eventually drew once Marcus's own business prominence made the situation newsworthy, effectively ended Camille's own standing within Atlanta's social and philanthropic circles. Rosa, the household's longtime housekeeper who had first quietly warned Destiny about Camille's mounting tension that fateful evening, remained employed within Marcus and Destiny's household in the years that followed, eventually becoming one of Destiny's most trusted confidants as she adjusted to her entirely transformed life circumstances. 2 years removed from that devastating dinner party, Destiny Reid, having formally taken her father's last name during the adoption proceedings that finalized her legal status as Marcus's daughter, has built a genuinely stable, secure life that stands in stark contrast to the 11 uncertain years she spent moving through Georgia's foster care system. She graduated high school with considerable academic distinction, driven by the same quiet, careful diligence that had once made her an exceptional household employee, now channeled fully into her own education and personal growth rather than the survival-driven work ethic that had defined so much of her difficult childhood. She maintains her mother's photographs, journal, and that unsent letter in a place of genuine honor within her new bedroom, understanding, with a clarity beyond her years, that Tanya's difficult, painful decision, however devastating its immediate consequences, had ultimately been made from a place of genuine, if desperate, love for a daughter she'd never wanted to burden with her own family's rejection. I spent 16 years believing I didn't really belong anywhere, Destiny said, in a rare public comment addressing her extraordinary story. I understand now that I always had a father out there who would have moved every mountain available to him to find me, if he'd only known I was alive. I try not to spend too much time thinking about the years that lie took from both of us. I try instead to be genuinely grateful for every single day I get now that I never thought I'd actually have. Marcus, for his part, has become in the years since a vocal advocate for foster care reform in Georgia, funding a considerable philanthropic initiative through Reid Dynamics specifically focused on supporting foster youth transitioning into independent adulthood, work he describes as directly, personally connected to understanding exactly how differently his own daughter's childhood might have unfolded with better systemic support in place.
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.